In this episode, we dive into the most horrifying pet attacks. From a woman who adopted a Rottweiler not knowing the dangers it brings, to a woman who was attacked by the neighbor's aggressive dog right at her front door. It was August 12, 2018, and the eastern Carpathian Mountains cast long shadows across the Popescu farm as the last day of the village harvest festival drew to a close. The air carried the sweet scent of ripening barley mixed with the earthy smell of ancient forests, a pastoral scene that would soon be shattered by primal violence. Lanel Popescu was shaped by the rhythms of rural Romanian life and a deep connection to the natural world. At 55, his weathered hands bore the calluses of someone who had spent decades working the soil. He was known throughout the region as someone with an almost mystical ability to connect with animals. Lanel's reputation as an animal whisperer had been built over decades of successful interactions with everything from injured wolves to abandoned fox cubs. Neighbors often brought him creatures they found in distress, and his success rate was legendary. This track record had given him dangerous confidence in his ability to tame even the most formidable predators. 8 years earlier, a female brown bear, weakened by a harsh winter and unable to care for her newborn cub, had been found dead near the village outskirts. The tiny cub, barely 3 weeks old and weighing less than 2 pounds, would have perished within hours without immediate intervention. When local authorities planned transport to a wildlife sanctuary, Lanel volunteered to provide temporary care. What began as a short-term rescue evolved into something permanent, as Lanel bottle-fed the cub every few hours, kept him warm, and gradually introduced solid foods as he grew stronger. The bear, whom Lanel named Ursu, simply bear in Romanian, thrived under his care and quickly became attracted to his human caretaker. As Ursu grew from a helpless cub into a powerful adult, Lanel constructed a specialized enclosure within his barn, measuring 20 by 30 feet with reinforced wooden walls topped by steel mesh. The space was designed with genuine care for the animal's comfort, complete with climbing structures, a small pool, and areas for both sun and shade. On this August afternoon, the Harvest Festival had drawn several local families to the farm for a traditional end-of-season celebration. Children ran through the barley fields while adults shared homemade tuica and discussed the year's crop yields. The highlight was always Lanel's demonstration with Ursu, an event that had become legendary throughout the region. Eurasian brown bears represent one of Europe's most formidable predator species, commanding both fear and respect from humans for millennia. Adult males can weigh over 600 pounds and stand nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, with curved claws up to 4 inches long and massive jaws designed for crushing and tearing. As the afternoon sun began to descend behind the Carpathian peaks, Lanel prepared for his demonstration. A group of 12 people gathered around the steel bars, including several children who pressed their faces against the mesh for a better view. Among the spectators were longtime neighbors, visiting relatives, and a few tourists who had heard about the famous tame bear. Lanel announced in his methodic Romanian dialect that Ursu was very special, explaining how he'd raised him from a tiny cub and that the bear knew he was family. He unlocked the heavy steel door, carrying a bucket filled with meat scraps, fish, and chunks of bread, the same routine they'd performed hundreds of times before. Lanel stepped confidently into the enclosure, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. Ursu approached slowly, his massive form moving with deceptive grace. At full size, the bear stood nearly as tall as Lanel when on his hind legs, and his bulk made the human appear almost childlike in comparison. But something was different this time. Perhaps it was the presence of many strangers, the unusual sounds and scents carried on the evening air, or some subtle change in Ursu's psychological state that had been building over months or years. Whatever triggered the bear's behavior, it deviated catastrophically from their established pattern. Without warning signs, no defensive posturing, no vocalizations, Ursus suddenly lunged forward with explosive power. His massive jaws opened to reveal 4-inch canine teeth, and he clamped down on Linnell's right shoulder with devastating force. The sound of breaking bones was clearly audible to horrified spectators. Linnell's confident expression vanished, replaced by shock and agony as Ursus' teeth penetrated through his heavy work shirt deep into the muscle and bone beneath. The bucket flew from his hands, scattering food across the concrete floor in a grotesque parody of their usual feeding ritual. Ursus' attack followed the typical pattern of brown bear aggression, a series of powerful bites and swipes designed to quickly incapacitate any threat. With Linnell's shoulder still locked in his jaws, the bear began shaking his massive head from side to side, tearing through muscle, tendons, and ligaments with horrifying efficiency. Spectators erupted into screams, while children were pulled away from the bars by panicked parents. Someone began shouting for help in Romanian, their voice cracking with panic and desperation as the peaceful harvest celebration transformed into a scene from humanity's darkest nightmares. Ursus released his grip only to immediately clamp down on the farmer's chest, his powerful jaws encompassing nearly the entire width of the torso. The bear's weight, over 650 pounds of muscle and bone, drove Linnell to the concrete floor with crushing force. The impact drove the air from his lungs and likely fractured several ribs even before Ursus' teeth found their mark. Blood began pooling beneath the body, spreading across the gray concrete in an ever-widening stain. Linnell's attempts to defend himself were pathetically inadequate against such overwhelming strength. His hands pushed weakly against the massive head, but it was like trying to move a mountain with bare fingers. George Popescu, Linnell's younger brother, grabbed a pitchfork and began striking the steel bars, creating a loud clanging sound in hopes of distracting the bear. He shouted desperately for Ursus to stop, to get away from his brother, his voice breaking with desperation and grief as he watched 8 years of trust and love dissolve into primal savagery. But Ursus was operating on pure predatory instinct now, his domesticated conditioning completely overwhelmed by millions of years of evolutionary programming. The bear stood on its hind legs to his full height, making him appear even more massive, then brought his full weight down on Linnell's prone form with bone-crushing impact. The farmer's ribs cracked audibly under the impact, and blood began flowing from his mouth as internal injuries mounted. Ursus' next bite targeted the abdomen, his powerful jaws clamping down below the rib cage, penetrating through skin and muscle into the abdominal cavity, causing massive internal trauma that no medical intervention could repair. The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the evening air, as a neighbor who lived several kilometers away had heard the screaming carried by the mountain wind and called the local gendarmerie. 2 police vehicles raced up the winding dirt road, their sirens wailing across the peaceful countryside. Sergeant Alexandru Radu, a 25-year veteran, emerged with his service weapon drawn. He dealt with various wildlife incidents throughout his career, but nothing had prepared him for this scene. The sight of a mutilated body lying in a pool of blood while a massive bear paced nearby triggered his training in dealing with immediate threats to public safety. With no tranquilizer equipment available and Ursus showing continued signs of agitation, there was no time to wait for specialized wildlife authorities. The rifle shot that ended Ursus' life echoed across the Carpathian foothills, causing flocks of birds to rise from the surrounding forests in a dark cloud. The massive bear collapsed beside Linnell's body, his 8-year journey from orphaned cub to beloved pet to killer finally at an end. Paramedics arrived 20 minutes later, but their services were no longer needed. The coroner's examination revealed massive trauma to the chest and abdomen, multiple fractured ribs, a broken femur, and catastrophic blood loss that had drained the life from a man who believed love could conquer nature's most fundamental laws. It was November 8, 2020. Local resident Tommy Raskin prepared for what he called the big one, a live stream featuring his 18-foot reticulated python, Cleo, in Kissimmee, Florida, a home to a thriving exotic pet community despite strict regulations. Tommy, age 32, grew up in Central Florida where he developed an early fascination with reptiles, spending countless hours at local nature centers and reptile expos. After high school, he worked various low-wage jobs but never pursued higher education or formal training in herpetology. His modest YouTube channel, focused almost exclusively on his reticulated python Cleo, reflected years of self-taught knowledge, though experts often criticized his handling techniques as risky and unprofessional. He was no celebrity. With fewer than 800 YouTube subscribers, he posted videos of Cleo slithering across his arms or feeding on thawed rabbits. By day, he drove for Uber and stocked shelves at a pet store. He lived alone, his social circle limited to online forums and reptile expos. His modest house was quiet except for his collection: several lizards, a small caiman, and Cleo, whom he considered special. He had acquired Cleo 4 years earlier when she was barely 2 feet long. He raised her methodically, with feeding schedules charted on a whiteboard and humidity levels recorded in spreadsheets. As she grew, his content began to revolve solely around her. Friends stopped calling. His sister blocked him after he missed her wedding to medicate Cleo. But Tommy didn't care. He believed he was proving that reptiles weren't just dumb killers. That fateful evening, Tommy prepared his camera for a live stream that would change everything. His plan was absurdly simple: lie shirtless on the floor, cover himself in rabbit scent, and record Cleo's reaction. He titled it, "What Happens If I Pretend to Be Prey?" Several subscribers urged him not to do it. One warned that pythons don't think the way humans hope. But Tommy, ever confident, insisted Cleo had never bitten him. After months of planning for this viral moment, Tommy couldn't contain his excitement. He took a thawed rabbit and rubbed its scent across his bare chest and arms as viewers began joining the stream. He positioned himself on the floor of the enclosure, smiling at the camera. As comments poured in, he drifted further into his fantasy, ignoring the danger lurking in the corner. Reticulated pythons are ambush predators, especially when presented with prey-scented, warm bodies. Pythons don't attack out of malice. They attack because millions of years of evolution had programmed them to associate those specific stimuli with food. A snake doesn't recognize your history together, your voice, or your intentions. It only recognizes feeding cues and threat cues. And a warm body covered in prey scent will always register as a feeding opportunity. Cleo approached slowly, tasting the air with her tongue. The smell drew her closer to Tommy, who lay peacefully on the floor. She raised her head, muscles tensed and ready. With lightning speed, she struck, wrapping her massive coils around his torso. He gasped in pain, trying to free himself as the snake constricted tighter with each exhaled breath. Viewers frantically typed warnings in the chat. They pleaded for someone to call 911, desperately trying to identify his location. By the time authorities forced their way into Tommy's home nearly an hour later, they found Cleo midway through consuming him. Her jaws stretched impossibly wide around his upper torso, slick with saliva. His legs were motionless, already halfway engulfed, and the pressure of her muscular coils had long since stopped his heart. Circulation to his brain had been cut off within minutes, and his internal organs were compressed beyond recovery. What was supposed to be a breakthrough viral video had turned into the most grotesque python attack in Florida's exotic pet history. The massive reticulated python that ended the 32-year-old's life remains housed at a secure facility, a living reminder of what happens when humans forget the untamed nature of apex predators. In the weeks that followed, Tommy's channel didn't go viral, it curdled. Viewers who once cheered his confidence now picked apart every interaction with Cleo, replaying moments where the warning signs flickered like static behind a smile. One clip showed her coiled loosely around his shoulders as he read fan comments aloud. Another caught her tightening on his wrist for a breath too long. He always laughed and would say that she was just feeling cuddly. Animal control removed her that same evening. She was deemed non-releasable and transferred to a private reptile facility where she remains in solitary containment. No name on her enclosure, just a cage, a heat lamp, and silence. It was January 15th, 2023. The Vermont winter had blanketed the countryside in pristine white snow, transforming Sarah Lawson's 5-acre property into a picturesque scene from a holiday card. For the 38-year-old social worker, the isolated farmhouse represented a fresh start after her divorce 2 years prior. Living alone had its challenges, but Sarah had always been independent and resilient, traits that served her well both in her personal life and in her demanding career helping children in the foster care system. Sarah's farmhouse sat at the edge of a long, winding driveway nearly a mile from her nearest neighbor. She had chosen this property specifically for its privacy and the surrounding natural beauty. The isolation rarely bothered her, except during the harshest winter storms when the power lines went down and the roads became impassable. 6 months earlier, Sarah had decided her home needed one more addition to be complete: a dog. After researching local rescues, she visited Second Chance Animal Shelter, where she first met Max, a 4-year-old Rottweiler Shepherd mix with soulful brown eyes and a gentle demeanor. The shelter staff explained that Max had been surrendered when his previous owner relocated for work. They described him as well-trained and protective without being aggressive, the perfect companion for a woman living alone. What they didn't tell Sarah was that Max had been removed from his previous home by animal control after severely biting a delivery driver. The shelter had made the ethically questionable decision to omit this information, fearing that Max would be euthanized if his history became known. For 6 months, Max proved to be everything Sarah had hoped for. His protective nature made her feel secure in her isolated home, and his affectionate personality provided the companionship she had been missing. Sarah often told friends that adopting Max was the best decision she had made since her divorce. What Sarah couldn't have known was that Max suffered from a rare neurological condition that caused unpredictable episodes of aggression. These episodes were triggered by specific stimuli, particularly high-pitched mechanical sounds, and resulted in temporary but complete personality changes. His previous owner had witnessed 2 such episodes, the second of which resulted in the attack on the delivery driver. The first warning signs appeared in December. Sarah noticed that Max became unusually agitated when she used her blender to make morning smoothies. He would pace anxiously, his ears flattened against his head until the noise stopped. She made a mental note to avoid using the blender when Max was in the kitchen, attributing his reaction to sensitive hearing rather than anything concerning. On January 15th, a severe winter storm had knocked out power and cell service across the region. As evening approached and the snowfall intensified, Sarah decided to prepare a simple dinner using the camping stove she kept for emergencies. Max lay contentedly on his bed in the corner of the kitchen, watching her movements with his usual attentiveness. After dinner, Sarah remembered the frozen berries in her freezer that would spoil if the power remained out overnight. She decided to use her hand-cranked blender to make a berry dessert. As she began turning the crank, the blender emitted a high-pitched whirring sound that echoed through the quiet home. Max's reaction was immediate and alarming. The 95-pound dog leapt to his feet, his body rigid and his eyes suddenly vacant. When she took a step toward him, he growled, a deep, threatening sound she had never heard from him before. Sarah froze, her heart racing as she realized the situation was rapidly deteriorating. In the dim light of her battery-powered lantern, Sarah could see that Max was no longer the gentle companion she knew. His hackles were raised, his lips pulled back to reveal gleaming teeth, and his eyes had no recognition of her. When she slowly backed toward the doorway, Max lunged forward with explosive force, knocking her to the hardwood floor. His powerful jaws clamped down on her forearm as she raised it instinctively to protect her face. The pain was immediate and overwhelming as Max's teeth crushed through muscle and scraped against bone. When she managed to pull her arm free, leaving skin and tissue in his jaws, Max immediately redirected his attack to her throat. She barely managed to get her knee up between them, giving her precious inches of protection as his teeth snapped centimeters from her jugular. With adrenaline surging through her body, Sarah remembered the heavy cast iron pan still sitting on the camping stove. She reached out, her fingers stretching until they grasped the hot handle. Ignoring the searing pain of the burn, she swung the pan with all her strength, connecting with the side of Max's head. The impact momentarily stunned him, allowing Sarah to scramble away and slam the kitchen door shut, trapping the dog inside. Bleeding profusely from her mangled arm and several puncture wounds on her shoulder and neck, Sarah stumbled through the darkened house to her front door. With no cell service and no close neighbors, Sarah faced an impossible choice: remain in the house with an aggressive dog separated only by a hollow interior door, or attempt to reach help through the blizzard. She chose to brave the storm, wrapping her bleeding arm in a kitchen towel and pulling on her coat with her good arm. The moment she stepped outside, the bitter cold and howling wind nearly knocked her off her feet. Sarah pushed forward, each step a struggle through knee-deep snow. The blood loss was making her dizzy, and the freezing temperature quickly numbed her extremities. She had managed to travel only a quarter mile down her driveway when her strength finally gave out. Sarah collapsed into the snow, her body no longer able to fight both the severe injuries and the extreme cold. 3 days later, when the roads were finally cleared enough for Sarah's colleague to check on her after she failed to report for work, authorities found a grim scene. Sarah's frozen body was discovered halfway down her driveway, a trail of blood marking her desperate journey through the snow. Inside the house, Max was found still confined to the kitchen, showing no signs of the aggression that had cost his owner her life. The injuries on Sarah's body were consistent with a canine attack. Deep puncture wounds, torn muscle tissue, and defensive marks on her arms. Investigators found blood smears and tufts of fur near the kitchen, along with a dented cast iron pan on the floor. Max's muzzle tested positive for Sarah's DNA, confirming he had bitten her before she fled the house. Subsequent investigation revealed the shelter's deception about Max's history and the uncovered medical records documenting his neurological condition. The case prompted new legislation in Vermont requiring full disclosure of animal bite histories in shelter adoptions. Max was humanely euthanized after examination confirmed an inoperable brain tumor that had likely caused his episodes of aggression. Evening of March 15, 2011 settled over the suburbs outside Brisbane, Australia, with the glow of streetlights flickering on and the distant hum of televisions filtering through open windows. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of dry grass and barbecue smoke, a typical late summer night in Queensland. In a quiet neighborhood lined with modest brick houses, 34-year-old Marcus Davidson welcomed a small group of friends into his backyard. 8 guests gathered, beers in hand, the sounds of casual laughter filling the night. It was meant to be a simple get-together, but Marcus had invited them for something special, a demonstration he had been eager to show off for months. For the past 2 years, Marcus had been raising Artemis, a 150-pound wolf-dog hybrid. The massive animal, with silver-gray fur and piercing yellow eyes, was the centerpiece of Marcus's fascination with owning something wild. He spoke about Artemis as if he were something rare and mystical, a creature few could ever truly understand. To Marcus, Artemis wasn't just a pet. He was proof that a man could tame the untamable. Marcus Davidson had always lived an ordinary life. Born and raised in Toowoomba, Queensland, he worked as a postal supervisor, played sports on weekends, and was known among friends for hosting backyard barbecues. He had never owned a pet as a child. His mother had been allergic, but after his 2008 divorce, something changed. He started seeking excitement, talking about taking risks, living life differently. That was when he found Artemis. The wolf dog had been listed on a classified site, described vaguely as a timber wolf mix by a breeder in rural Queensland. The photo showed an enormous, wild-looking animal, unlike anything Marcus had seen before. He was immediately drawn to its exotic appearance, imagining how impressive it would be to own something so powerful. Without experience in handling large predators, he purchased Artemis and had him delivered. He told friends it was like having a piece of the wild in his backyard. But wolf-dog hybrids are not fully domesticated animals. Weighing between 130 and 175 pounds, they retain the instincts of wild wolves, including territorial aggression and an unpredictable prey drive. Their jaw strength exceeds 400 pounds per square inch, more than enough to crush bone, and their intelligence allows them to escape enclosures that would contain ordinary dogs. Unlike fully domesticated breeds, wolf hybrids do not recognize humans as leaders in the way dogs do. They can be affectionate one moment and triggered into a full predatory response the next. In most Australian states, wolf dog hybrids are illegal, but underground breeders continue to supply them to inexperienced owners. Marcus had no formal training, no specialized knowledge, and no permits. What he had was confidence, and a belief that his bond with Artemis made him different from other owners. The warning signs came early. Trevor Wilson, his next-door neighbor, recalled seeing Artemis pace along the fence line whenever children passed, his yellow eyes tracking them in eerie silence. In November 2010, Marcus required stitches after Artemis bit through his forearm, tearing through skin and muscle. 2 months later, the wolf dog escaped his enclosure and attacked a neighbor's Labrador, forcing 3 men to pull them apart. Veterinarian Dr. Rajiv Patel, who treated Artemis after the dog attack, warned Marcus directly. The animal displayed clear predatory behaviors and should not be kept in a residential area. Marcus dismissed the concern, saying Artemis was just playing rough. On March 15, 2011, Marcus invited 8 friends over for drinks and a special demonstration. Witnesses later stated that Marcus had been drinking heavily, boasting about how well-trained Artemis had become. At 8:32 p.m., he led the group outside to the 1,000 square foot enclosure, where security cameras recorded the entire event. The wolf dog was already inside, pacing the perimeter, ears flat, tail stiff. His posture was tense, his hackles raised. A warning Marcus either failed to notice or ignored. He turned to his friends, grinning, and stepped inside the enclosure. For 2 minutes, Marcus crouched beside Artemis, running a hand along the thick fur at the base of his neck, speaking in a low, steady voice as the wolf dog paced in place. He had done this many times before, letting Artemis settle before guiding him into what he called their trust exercises. Moments where he would gently grip the animal's scruff or place a hand on his muzzle to show his dominance. His friends watched in silence, some with amusement, others with unease, as Marcus shifted his weight, preparing for the next step. He was going to have Artemis sit beside him, lean into his touch, and allow Marcus to momentarily place a hand over his snout, proof in his mind that their bond was unbreakable. But as he reached forward, Artemis stiffened, his body going rigid, ears pinning flat against his skull. To Marcus, it was hesitation, a sign that he needed to reassure the animal. But to Artemis, this movement was a challenge, one that required an immediate and violent response. Artemis clamped his jaws around Marcus's throat, his powerful teeth crushing the windpipe instantly. Marcus staggered backward, arms flailing, his friends frozen in shock. As Marcus fell, the wolf dog shook his head violently, the instinctive motion of a predator breaking the neck of its prey. The enclosure erupted into chaos. One guest threw a chair against the fence, another grabbed a garden hose, spraying water in a desperate attempt to distract Artemis. Nothing worked. By 8:39 p.m., Marcus had stopped moving, but the attack didn't end. With his prey motionless, Artemis began tearing into Marcus's abdomen and upper thigh, ripping through muscle and crushing bone with single-minded focus. Blood soaked into the dirt, and his friends finally realized they were watching their friend being eaten alive. Jessica Taylor, one of the friends, managed to dial emergency services at 8:40 p.m., her voice barely comprehensible through panic. First responders arrived at 8:56 p.m., but the enclosure was still too dangerous to enter. Artemis stood over Marcus's body, his ears flat, fur bristling, guarding his kill. It took 3 tranquilizer darts to subdue him. Even as the sedatives took effect, he continued licking the blood from his muzzle. By the time paramedics reached Marcus nearly 30 minutes later, he was pronounced dead at the scene. The autopsy later confirmed that Marcus had died from massive blood loss and asphyxiation. Defensive wounds on his hands and arms showed his desperate attempts to fight back, but Artemis's bite had crushed his trachea within seconds. The medical examiner estimated that 5 to 7 pounds of tissue had been consumed from his abdomen, chest, and legs. Queensland wildlife authorities euthanized Artemis the following day. In the days following the attack, Marcus's friends struggled to process what they had witnessed. Some refused to speak about it, shaken by the sheer brutality of the moment, while others replayed it in their minds, questioning if there had been any warning signs they had missed. The group that had once gathered regularly in his backyard for barbecues and casual drinks now found themselves avoiding the place altogether, unable to shake the memory of that night. Within the local community, the news spread quickly, with neighbors expressing a mix of shock and unease. Some had heard Artemis's deep, guttural howls at night, but never imagined the wolf dog would turn on its owner. Others admitted they had always been wary of the animal, recalling the way it paced along the fence line, watching passers-by with an intensity that never felt quite right. The tragedy reignited concerns over exotic pet ownership, particularly the unchecked breeding and sale of wolf hybrids. Wildlife officials began cracking down on illegal breeders in the area, but no immediate legislation was passed to prevent similar cases in the future. For those who had known Marcus personally, his death served as a grim reminder that no amount of trust or familiarity could strip a predator of its instincts. Artemis had not acted out of malice or rage, only nature. It was September 3rd, 2017, and humid Florida air hung thick over the suburban neighborhood of Lakeland, where Spanish moss draped from ancient oak trees like funeral shrouds. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly, pushing temperatures into the mid-90s. Rick Mendez was addicted to attention and validation in the digital age. At 39, he built his entire identity around his social media presence, particularly on TikTok and Instagram, where videos featuring Princess regularly garnered hundreds of thousands of views. What had started as genuine fascination with reptiles had morphed into something more dangerous, a relentless pursuit of viral content. The backyard pool party was meant to be the ultimate content creation opportunity. His nephew Miguel's 8th birthday combined with a live demonstration that would surely break his previous view records. Ricky had been planning this moment for weeks. Princess was an impressive specimen, measuring just over 7 feet from snout to tail and weighing approximately 180 pounds. Her dark armored hide bore scars from early life in the wild before Ricky had acquired her through questionable channels 5 years earlier. The modified above-ground pool dominated the far corner of the property, originally intended for swimming but drained and converted into a habitat for Princess. The pool walls had been reinforced with concrete blocks, and a custom filtration system maintained water quality in what Ricky proudly called his backyard Everglades. American alligators represent one of nature's most successful predators, virtually unchanged by evolution for over 200 million years. They're perfectly adapted for life as ambush hunters in aquatic environments, capable of remaining motionless for hours, then exploding into action with lightning speed. The birthday party was in full swing by 4 p.m. with approximately 15 guests ranging from young children to elderly grandparents. Adults clustered around patio tables with cold beers, while children ran around the yard, their laughter mixing with sounds of Latin music that would soon be replaced by screams. At exactly 4:12 p.m., Ricky stepped over the pool's edge into the shallow water, his bare feet finding purchase on the concrete bottom. Princess lay motionless on her basking platform with only her eyes and nostrils visible above the waterline, appearing almost statue-like in her stillness, a deception that would prove fatal. What happened next defied all of Ricky's previous experience with Princess. Without any warning signs, Princess exploded into motion with terrifying speed that had made her species apex predators for millions of years. Her massive jaws opened to reveal rows of canonical teeth, and she lunged forward, clamping down on Ricky's left forearm with crushing force that shattered the radius and ulna instantly. The sound of breaking bones was clearly audible above the sudden screams of party guests. Ricky's confident smile vanished, replaced by an expression of shock and disbelief as Princess's jaws locked around his arm like a biological vice. With Ricky's arm still trapped in her jaws, Princess immediately began the death roll that is the signature killing technique of all crocodilians. She began spinning rapidly in the water, her powerful tail providing the torque necessary to generate tremendous rotational force that created devastating stress on joints and bones. Ricky's screams of agony filled the backyard as Princess continued her deadly rotation. His left arm, still locked in her jaws, began to separate from his shoulder as tendons, muscle, and ligaments were stretched beyond their breaking point. Blood clouded the pool water, creating a crimson swirl that followed the alligator's movements. Party guests reacted with a mixture of horror and paralysis. Children screamed and ran toward the house while adults stood frozen in shock. Carmen Mendez, Ricky's sister, began screaming his name while frantically dialing 911 with trembling fingers. Princess completed her first death roll and surfaced briefly, Ricky's mangled arm still clamped in her jaws. The force of rotation had torn his shoulder from its socket, and his left arm now hung at an impossible angle, connected to his torso by only a few remaining strands of muscle and skin. But Princess wasn't finished. Repositioning her grip, she released Ricky's destroyed arm, only to clamp down on his midsection with even greater force. Her teeth penetrated through his ribs and into internal organs, while the second death roll proved even more devastating than the first, spinning with mechanical precision that pulverized bone and tissue. Emergency services arrived to find a scene that defied training and experience. Captain James Morrison, a 20-year veteran, had dealt with various animal attacks, but nothing had prepared him for the blood-filled pool, floating body parts, and massive alligators still circling her victim with predatory satisfaction. Dr. Sarah Chen, the county's wildlife veterinarian, made the difficult decision to use lethal force rather than risk additional casualties. The rifle shot that ended Princess's life echoed across the suburban neighborhood, finally allowing rescue personnel to enter the pool and recover what remained of Ricky Mendez. March 19, 2017 was warm and dry in the fertile valley of Franschhoek, where vineyards spread across the hills like green patchwork and the late afternoon air smelled faintly of smoke and jasmine. The dirt roads behind the wine estates led to quieter properties, places tucked behind electronic gates where foreigners came to retire in luxury. One of those belonged to Daniel Thatcher, a 50-year-old former software engineer from Texas. His home sat on 40 acres of converted farmland with a main house, 2 guest cottages, and a high-walled enclosure at the back. He called it a reserve, though it wasn't open to the public. Locals simply called it the place with the tiger. Daniel had arrived in South Africa in 2012, shortly after selling his company for a figure large enough that he never had to work again. He and his wife had dreamed of a slower life, land, animals, quiet mornings. But for Daniel, animals meant more than horses and chickens. Within a year, he'd begun acquiring exotic species. 2 zebras, a capuchin monkey, an aging cheetah from a failed rehabilitation center, and eventually a Bengal tiger named Raka. He built enclosures with the help of a local contractor, hired a rotating staff of handlers, and poured money into fencing, feeding, and veterinary care. It was self-funded, unlicensed, and unregulated, but pristine. Daniel wasn't careless, he had rules, and for years those rules had kept everyone safe. His neighbors respected him, many admired what he had built, and a few, like the Maboya family from a nearby village, became regular guests. Sifo and Lindui Maboya would often visit with their 2 children, Brian and Ella. They'd sit on the garden terrace sipping coffee while the kids toured the grounds with Daniel's staff, snapping pictures beside the animals and asking the kind of questions only teenagers can. How fast can it run? Does it like people? Can I take a photo with it? Tigers, particularly Bengal tigers like Raka, are ambush predators built for explosive power and precision. A full-grown male can weigh more than 500 pounds, leap over 20 feet, and deliver a bone-breaking bite with jaws capable of exerting over 1,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. In the wild, they're solitary hunters, striking without warning and aiming for the neck or throat. In captivity, their instincts remain intact, even if their world is smaller. On that particular Sunday, things were no different. The Maboyas arrived mid-morning. Daniel greeted them at the gate with his usual warmth, led them to the terrace, and sent one of his assistants, a young man named Jerome, to walk the kids around. The cheetah was sleeping, the monkey was in its hammock. The tiger Raka lay stretched in the sun at the far end of his yard, his amber eyes half-lidded. He looked peaceful. Raka was Daniel's pride. He had come to the reserve 5 years earlier from a failed breeding operation in Gauteng. At full size, he weighed nearly 500 pounds and stretched over 10 feet from nose to tail. His paws were massive, his canines yellowed but intact, and his behavior was generally calm, but staff had noted changes in recent months. He'd begun pacing more, he'd responded to commands more slowly. A week earlier, he had growled during a feeding. Still, he hadn't shown open aggression, so the photo routine continued. Jerome led Brian to the edge of the inner fence, a reinforced barrier between the walking path and the tiger yard. They had done it all before. Brian would crouch down, flash a peace sign, and Jerome would frame the shot so the tiger appeared closer than he really was. But this time, something changed. As Brian crouched, Raka rose. It was subtle at first, a flick of the tail, a shift in weight. But as Brian adjusted his stance, turning slightly to the left, Raka moved fast. In a blur, he surged toward the fence, leapt onto the lower ledge at the corner, and slammed his weight against the gate separating the inner and outer enclosure. The latch gave. The sound was like metal snapping under tension. Jerome shouted and stepped forward, but it was too late. Raka lunged, hitting Brian with the full weight of his body and knocking him backward onto the gravel. His teeth found the boy's shoulder first, then the neck. Blood arced across the walkway. Brian screamed once before it turned into choking gasps. Jerome grabbed a metal pole from the ground and struck the tiger's flank, but it barely registered. Raka twisted, dragging the boy several feet along the path, jaws still locked. Back at the house, Sifo and Lindue heard the commotion. They ran as Jerome continued striking, yelling, doing anything to break the animal's grip. 2 other staff members arrived seconds later with fire extinguishers, standard protocol for emergencies. The sudden blast of foam and sound startled Raka enough that he loosened his hold. Jerome pulled Brian's body away while the others formed a line between them and the tiger, who now paced near the far wall, growling low. An emergency call was made from the house. Paramedics arrived within 15 minutes, but Brian had already lost too much blood. His carotid artery had been severed and his trachea was partially collapsed. CPR was attempted on site, but he was pronounced dead before the ambulance could leave the property. The postmortem confirmed what responders already knew. Brian had died from massive blood loss after sustaining deep puncture wounds to his neck and shoulder. The injuries were fatal within minutes. The enclosure gate investigators found had been reinforced only once in 5 years, using a modified garden latch not built to withstand the force of a full-grown tiger. Authorities shut the facility down within a week. The animals were removed, and Raka, after exhibiting further aggression during transfer, was euthanized by order of the Provincial Wildlife Board. Daniel was not charged, but a civil case moved forward citing negligence and failure to follow enclosure safety recommendations from years prior. Brian's funeral was held in the village cemetery, with classmates standing quietly in uniform along the edge of the grave. Ella stayed home from school for nearly a month. Daniel left South Africa the following year. The land was sold, the fences came down, and whatever goodwill he had built faded behind the silence he left behind. October 12, 2018 was quiet on the third floor of Oakline Towers, a brick apartment building tucked behind a convenience store and a stretch of chain-link fencing in Newark's West Ward. The air outside smelled faintly of trash and wet leaves, and inside the halls were narrow and dimly lit, with peeling paint and the occasional flicker from old motion sensors. Tenants came and went quietly, nobody lingered. And for Kendra Wallace, that silence had started to feel like a warning. She was 29, a pharmacy technician with a short commute and a routine that rarely changed. Friends described her as cautious, sharp-witted, and warm, the kind of person who left small gifts outside neighbors' doors during the holidays and always reminded the kids upstairs to lock their bikes. Kendra didn't look for trouble. She minded her business, paid rent on time, and kept to herself. But for months, she had been afraid to step outside her door, and the reason was always the same. Matthew Reyes lived 4 doors down. He was 36, worked late shifts at a freight warehouse across town, and rarely spoke to anyone in the building. He wasn't unfriendly, just detached, the kind of tenant who nodded in passing but kept his head down and his schedule off everyone else's radar. What people remembered wasn't Matthew, it was his dog. Diesel, a massive Presa Canario with cropped ears and a thick leather collar, had been with him for over 3 years. The breed, originally developed in the Canary Islands for guarding livestock, is known for its imposing size, territorial nature, and explosive strength. Adult males can top 130 pounds and exert more than 500 pounds of bite pressure, enough to break bone and crush joints. In the wrong hands, they can be lethal. Diesel had already lunged at a delivery driver and once charged a child near the stairwell before Matthew hauled him back. Several tenants had seen him snarl and throw his weight into the leash when anyone got too close. Kendra had grown used to the low growl through her door when they passed in the hall. She had filed multiple complaints, 2 emails, 1 phone call, and even flagged down a passing animal control officer in the parking lot. She described Diesel's behavior, asked for someone to investigate, begged for enforcement, but no inspection was ever scheduled, no citation issued, and nothing about Diesel's presence ever changed. The reports were taken and quietly forgotten. With each passing week, Kendra grew more cautious. By October, Kendra had developed a habit one her neighbors noticed. She'd press her ear to the door before leaving, listening for footsteps, keys, or the low rattle of a leash. If she heard anything, she waited. She knew the signs. Diesel was too strong for most to handle, and Matthew never used a muzzle. So Kendra waited, and when it seemed quiet, she stepped out. That Friday night, she was taking out a single bag of trash, just a short walk to the chute at the end of the hall. She opened her door like always, but this time she didn't get the chance to listen first. Diesel was already there. He lunged before she could register what she was seeing. The first bite sank into her upper thigh, locking her in place as his full weight crashed into her side. She screamed and fell backward, hitting the floor hard. The trash bag burst open beside her. Diesel didn't let go. He bit again, lower this time, shaking his head violently and dragging her across the thin carpet toward the stairwell wall. Her leg tore open under the pressure. Blood smeared the floor. Doors flew open. Someone shouted. A neighbor ran toward the scene with a broomstick, swinging wildly at Diesel's back. Another tenant threw a laundry basket, but nothing broke his focus. Diesel was locked in, his jaws clamped, paws braced, the hallway echoing with snarls and screams. The attack lasted nearly 2 minutes. It ended when Matthew dropped to the ground and twisted Diesel's tail hard while yanking his back legs out from under him. A brutal but effective maneuver used by handlers to break a dog's grip. Diesel let go with a snarl, stumbling sideways as Matthew dragged him away by the collar, still thrashing and trying to turn back. Diesel fought against him even as Kendra lay bleeding on the floor, eyes wide, lips moving without sound. A neighbor pressed towels to the wound and screamed for someone to call 911. Blood soaked through within seconds. Paramedics arrived fast, but her femoral artery had been severed. She lost consciousness before they reached the ambulance and was pronounced dead en route to the hospital. The autopsy confirmed what witnesses had already described. Kendra had bled out from catastrophic vascular damage to her upper leg and hip. The bite force had ruptured her femoral artery, and the speed of blood loss left no chance for recovery. The injuries were consistent with a high-pressure attack from a large Mastiff-type breed. Swift, brutal, and impossible to survive without immediate surgical intervention. The aftermath moved swiftly. Investigators confirmed that animal control had received multiple complaints about Diesel but failed to act. Police records showed no formal warnings had ever been issued to Matthew Reyes. Under pressure from city officials, a review was launched into enforcement failures. Matthew was cited for negligence and housing violations, but no criminal charges were filed. Diesel was seized and euthanized by court order. Kendra's family filed a civil lawsuit citing ongoing negligence and failure to enforce building safety policies. Matthew left the building within days. His unit stayed vacant for nearly a year. Kendra's funeral was held in East Orange. Neighbors filled the pews, many who'd barely known her, but all who had seen her kindness in passing. Her mother spoke quietly, saying no one should have to live in fear of stepping into their own hallway. It was December 5th, 2023. The winter chill had settled over Portland, Oregon as the holiday season approached. For 6-year-old Loyalty Charles Scott, affectionately known as Mookie to his family, it was just another school day. The first grader at Glenfair Elementary had no idea that this ordinary Tuesday morning would be his last. Loyalty was being raised by his grandmother, Rena Scott, the steady heart of a bustling household. She had taken on the responsibility of raising several of her grandchildren, including Loyalty, and she did so with unwavering love. Her days revolved around them: school drop-offs, warm dinners, clean clothes, and constant affection. Loyalty was her shadow, her joy, and her reason for pushing forward. Everyone who knew Loyalty spoke of the same thing: his radiant presence. Even at 6 years old, he carried a warmth that seemed to disarm the world around him. He smiled constantly, shared freely, and brought light into any room he entered. Teachers noticed how he offered help without being asked, looked out for classmates who felt left out, and made sure no one ever played alone during recess. He had the kind of heart that left a mark. Each weekday morning followed a familiar routine. Rena would drive him to the home of her longtime friend Coco Miller, who then took him the rest of the way to school. Coco had known the family for years. She was a trusted figure in their lives, someone Rena believed would care for Loyalty like her own. But there was something the Scott family hadn't fully grasped, something dangerous hidden behind Coco's front door. Coco presented herself as the head of a dog training and protection business, calling it Canine Protection. Her online persona showed a flair for theatrics, posing with weapons, adopting an aggressive brand. But behind that facade, the real threat lived in her garage. Two massive, unregistered, mastiff-type dogs, each weighing over 100 pounds and bred specifically for aggression and territorial defense. To her credit, Coco had always kept Loyalty separated from the animals. She understood they weren't family pets. They were trained to respond to perceived threats, and she never intended for him to come near them. But no amount of caution could erase a child's curiosity or predict the split-second decisions of a 6-year-old. That morning, like so many other, Rena dropped Loyalty off at Coco's home. He was bundled in his jacket, backpack slung over his shoulder, ready for school and unaware of the danger that lay just beyond a door. Inside the house, everything was normal. Coco prepared for the day, leaving Loyalty inside while she stepped into the garage to check on the dogs. What happened next unfolded in seconds. Perhaps Loyalty thought it was time to leave, or maybe he just wanted to peek inside. Whatever the reason, he opened the door to the garage, and that single motion unraveled everything. The larger of the two dogs saw movement and instantly went on the attack. In an explosion of muscle and instinct, it lunged at the boy, slamming him backward onto the cold concrete. Loyalty screamed. The dog clamped down on his arm, crushing bone and ripping flesh. The second dog, aroused by the chaos, joined in, blocking the only escape. Coco turned at the sound and raced toward the boy, yelling for the dogs to stop. But her voice held no weight against the frenzy now consuming the animals. The first dog released Loyalty's arm only to latch onto his small torso. The second grabbed his leg. Together, they pulled in opposite directions, tearing the child's body with terrifying force. Desperate, Coco threw herself into the melee, grabbing at collars, striking with her fists, anything to break the grip. When that failed, she reached for a bat from a nearby shelf and swung it across one dog's back. It barely reacted. Their focus was absolute. Loyalty's body grew limp beneath them. His screams weakened to whimpers and then fell silent. Blood pooled beneath him. In a final, frantic attempt to save him, Coco threw herself over his body, shielding him with her own and trying to reach a handgun she kept nearby. She managed to grab it, but by the time she looked down, the damage had already been done. Loyalty's chest no longer moved. His eyes were fixed and empty. The realization shattered her. The gun slipped from her hand. The dogs, now quiet, slowly backed away, their mouths stained in red. When emergency responders arrived just after 7:30 a.m., they found Coco on the floor, cradling Loyalty's broken body in her arms. He was pronounced dead at the scene. There was nothing they could do. The attack sent shockwaves through the community. At Glenfair Elementary, teachers wept. Counselors struggled to find words for his classmates. Loyalty had been the kind of child who brought joy without trying. His loss left a silence that no one could fill. His grandmother, who had poured her heart into raising him, was devastated beyond words. Friends and family described her as crushed, unable to comprehend how a trusted routine had ended in tragedy. Authorities removed the dogs and euthanized them days later. Months after the attack, Coco Miller was indicted on multiple felony charges, including criminally neglect homicide and first-degree mistreatment. The investigation revealed just how preventable the incident had been. Unregistered dogs, unprotected access, and a child placed too close to a threat that never should have existed. The early morning sun on September 14, 2016, filtered through the dense pine forests, casting long shadows across the quiet rural roads of eastern North Carolina. The air was thick with late summer humidity, and the only sounds to be heard were the Carolina chickadees calling from the treetops. Here, in a secluded town just over 2 hours east of Charlotte, stretches of farmland and woodland separated small communities where neighbors rarely questioned what went on behind closed doors. It was the kind of place where someone could live in near isolation, undisturbed, even if they kept an apex predator in their home. At the edge of one such road, Olivia Carter's house sat tucked away behind a gravel driveway, hidden from view by a dense wall of trees. At 37 years old, Olivia had built a life of independence. She was unmarried, had no children, and worked a remote corporate job that gave her financial stability without the need to leave her property. That same financial freedom had also allowed her to pursue something far more unusual: the private ownership of a wild animal. For the past 2 years, she had shared her home with Kai, a 42-pound African caracal, a species known for its lethal hunting skills, powerful build, and unmatched agility. Unlike most exotic animal owners, Olivia hadn't built a secure outdoor enclosure or kept Kai in a controlled space. He had full reign of the house. She believed their bond made her different from other owners. But on that quiet September morning, Kai would prove that no amount of human care could override the instincts of a predator. Caracals are native to Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, built for hunting with razor-sharp claws, powerful hind legs, and keen predatory instincts. Unlike domesticated cats, caracals retain their wild nature, even when raised from birth. They strike with precision, their bite force strong enough to crush bone, and their coiled muscles give them the ability to leap over 10 feet into the air, a skill designed for taking down birds but just as effective on larger prey. Despite these facts, Olivia never saw Kai as a threat. She had imported him from a breeder outside the US, spending thousands of dollars on transport and veterinary clearances to bring him into North Carolina, a state with no restrictions on owning exotic big cats. Unlike in other states where such animals required permits and inspections, there were no legal barriers, no oversight, and no regulations preventing her from housing a wild predator inside her home. She had raised him from a kitten, treating him like a pet. He lounged on her furniture, followed her from room to room, and slept at the foot of her bed. But there had been signs. Aggressive swipes with claws extended, guttural growls when startled, a deep bite that had left a scar on her arm months prior. Friends had warned her that exotic animal experts cautioned against keeping caracals as pets, but Olivia was convinced she understood him better than anyone else could. At 10:15 a.m., Olivia was on a video call with her younger sister Erin Carter, who lived out of the state. Erin later recalled that Olivia had been standing near the kitchen counter chatting casually as she prepared Kai's raw meat breakfast. Kai was pacing nearby, his ears pinned back, tail twitching, a posture Erin had noticed before but never thought much about. Olivia had always joked that he was impatient for food, brushing off concerns, as if Kai's restlessness was nothing more than a quirky habit. Seconds later, everything changed. Kai launched forward without warning, his claws raking deep across Olivia's face before she could react. The phone jolted as Olivia stumbled backwards, screaming, the image blurring with violent movement. Erin's panicked voice rang through the call, but there was no response. Kai latched onto Olivia's arm, his powerful jaws clamping down to the bone. A loud crash echoed through the phone as furniture scraped across the tile floor, Olivia struggling to break free. The phone, knocked from her grasp, landed face up, still transmitting. Erin listened as the sounds of Olivia's struggle filled the call. Screams, heavy breathing, the deep growls of the caracal. She ended the call and immediately dialed 911. The dispatcher answered, but Erin was calling from out of state, and her location routed her to her local emergency services. She quickly explained the situation, but the dispatcher couldn't send help directly. Erin needed to call 911 for Olivia's location. They provided her with the correct 10-digit number for emergency services in North Carolina. Before dialing again, Erin frantically searched her phone for Olivia's address. In her panic, she couldn't recall it immediately, scrolling through old messages and emails until she found it. Only then did she call the emergency services for Olivia's location, relaying the full address. At 10:27 a.m., first responders were finally dispatched to the scene with animal control officers. By the time they arrived, it was already too late. Emergency responders broke through the front door to find Kai still hunched over Olivia's lifeless body, his ears flattened, muscles coiled, fur bristling. He didn't flee, he didn't hide. He was guarding his kill. The animal control officers trained in handling dangerous exotic animals moved in with catch poles and tranquilizer darts. Kai let out a low growl but didn't resist, his instincts still locked in predator mode. As they restrained him, he licked the blood from his muzzle. Erin had already hung up, but when emergency services finally arrived, she received the call she had been dreading. The dispatcher confirmed what she already feared. Olivia was unresponsive. The paramedics and police had entered the house, but there was nothing they could do. Olivia was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner's report confirmed that Olivia suffered fatal blood loss from deep lacerations to her face, arms, and neck. But the final injury had been a bite to the throat that severed her carotid artery. A precision kill, exactly how caracals take down prey in the wild. The story spread quickly, sparking renewed debates over the dangers of private exotic animal ownership. Experts pointed out that while caracals are smaller than big cats, they're still wild animals, with reflexes, strength, and instincts that no human can ever fully control. Still, no legislation was made banning the ownership of such animals. As for Kai, he was transferred to a wildlife sanctuary placed in a secure habitat away from human interaction. Officials ruled that he would not be euthanized, as the attack was deemed a natural predatory response rather than abnormal aggression. It was November 18, 2014, and thick strands of oak and maple trees bordered the Kemp residence in Knott County, Ohio. The remote farmhouse sat on 6 acres surrounded by rolling hills, the perfect setting for Valerie Kemp's dangerous obsession with proving that apex predators could be loving companions. Valerie was driven by desperate need for validation and attention. At 42, she'd spent most of her adult life feeling invisible and unremarkable. Her marriage ended in bitter divorce. Her children rarely visited, and she struggled with profound loneliness. The exotic animal community had become her refuge, a place where she could reinvent herself as an expert. Her transformation from lonely divorcee to self-proclaimed big cat expert had been gradual but complete. She'd spent hours researching tiger behavior, joined online forums, and gradually convinced herself that she possessed special insights into feline psychology. What started as genuine fascination had evolved into dangerous delusion. Valerie had built a passionate community of viewers who tuned in regularly to watch her interact with Shiva, a magnificent Bengal tiger she'd raised from a 6-week-old cub. The tiger had been her constant companion for 5 years, living inside the house like an oversized domestic cat. She genuinely believed their bond transcended the natural order. That evening, Valerie had invited 2 special guests to witness Shiva's grooming routine. Dr. Marcus Webb, a local veterinarian who had repeatedly warned her about the dangers, and Jennifer Martinez, her closest friend, who had grown increasingly concerned about Valerie's reckless behavior. Shiva was an absolutely magnificent specimen, measuring nearly 10 feet from nose to tail tip and weighing just over 500 pounds. His coat displayed the classic Bengal pattern, brilliant orange with bold black stripes. His massive head featured piercing amber eyes and 4-inch canine teeth. Bengal tigers represent the apex of feline evolution. Native to the Indian subcontinent, they're the largest wildcats in the world, with males regularly exceeding 600 pounds. Their bite force exceeds 1,000 pounds per square inch. At exactly 7:30 p.m., Valerie positioned herself beside Shiva, who was lying on his side in a relaxed state. She held the professional grooming brush, speaking to her online audience about how gentle and loving Shiva really was. For nearly 12 minutes, the session proceeded without incident, with Shiva remaining calm and cooperative. At 7:42 p.m., Valerie turned her back briefly to adjust the laptop's camera angle. She reached across the coffee table, her attention focused on the screen for perhaps 3 seconds. In that instant, something fundamental shifted in Shiva's demeanor. a switch that flipped from domesticated companion to apex predator. Without warning, the tiger's predatory nature asserted itself with terrifying swiftness. Shiva rose to his feet with fluid grace, his massive frame uncoiling like a spring. The attack was sudden and devastating as the tiger lunged forward, clamping his jaws around Valerie's left thigh, his 4-inch canines penetrating deep into muscle tissue. The force of the bite was so powerful that her femur cracked audibly under pressure. Valerie's scream filled the room as Shiva's grip tightened, his jaw muscles contracting with hydraulic force. Dr. Webb shouted in alarm, reaching for a push broom while Jennifer backed toward the front door. Shiva then began the characteristic head-shaking motion, thrashing his massive head from side to side, tearing through muscle, tendons, and blood vessels. The tiger's weight dragged Valerie down onto the carpet, her back striking the floor with a sickening thud. Shiva repositioned himself over her prone form, his amber eyes displaying the cold focus of a predator in full hunting mode. The tiger's next bite targeted Valerie's torso, clamping down below the ribcage. Crushing force compressed internal organs while canine teeth punctured through skin and muscle into the abdominal cavity. Blood began pooling beneath her body, soaking into the carpet and spreading outward in an ever-widening crimson stain. Dr. Webb finally connected with emergency services, screaming into the phone for immediate assistance. By the time the first police officers burst through the front door exactly 9 minutes after the initial 911 call, Valerie's body had stopped moving entirely. Shiva stood over his victim, blood dripping from his muzzle onto the carpet below. Officers drew their weapons, while the tiger's amber eyes fixed on the new arrivals with predatory interest. Sergeant Rodriguez made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career, raising his weapon and firing 3 shots in rapid succession. April 16, 2000 began like any other cool spring day in Voronezh. The last patches of snow had melted and the gray clouds drifted over rows of dacha roofs and fenced-in garden plots. The streets were quiet that afternoon in the Morozov's neighborhood, an older residential stretch just outside the city center. Beyond a faded iron gate, the couple's modest brick home sat tucked behind a line of bare trees. Laundry hung on a line in the yard. A bicycle leaned against the fence. Nothing about the scene suggested what was about to happen inside. Yulia Morozova was 34, a former schoolteacher who had stepped away from the classroom a few years earlier after her mother fell ill. Quiet and soft-spoken, she had a gentle confidence about her that made her popular with students, especially the younger ones. She loved watercolor painting, kept her garden meticulous, and had a habit of rescuing injured animals from the side of the road, nursing birds and kittens back to health in the spare room. Friends described her as deeply empathetic, the kind of person who remembered birthdays and never forgot to send thank you cards. Children gravitated to her, so did animals. Her husband Pavel, 35, worked in construction and had recently started a small roofing business with a childhood friend. They didn't have children, though neighbors recalled they once planned to adopt. Instead, their home was filled with little personal comforts. Stacked books in the hallway, homemade jam in the cupboard, and music always playing low in the background. It wasn't a flashy life, but it was a close one. And for the past 12 years, they had shared it with a chimpanzee. Stefan had arrived as a baby, gifted to Pavel by a business contact from Moscow who dabbled in exotic animal trade. At first, he was a novelty. They bottle-fed him, dressed him in hand-sewn clothes, and posed him for family photos. Neighbors would stop by just to see him wave. He learned basic routines quickly, how to sit at the table, open cabinet doors, bring in the newspaper. In photos from those early years, he sat between them on the couch like a child. Yulia especially doted on him. She treated Stefan like an extension of the family, brushing his fur after meals, stroking his head when he grew agitated. Even as he grew stronger, she believed she understood him, that her calmness kept him calm too. But chimpanzees are not built for domestic life. In the wild, adult males can weigh over 130 pounds and possess 5 to 6 times the upper body strength of an average human. Their arms are designed for climbing and overpowering prey, and their canine teeth, especially in mature males, can inflict catastrophic injuries. Stefan's strength began to reveal itself early. By the time he turned 7, he could lift furniture without effort, bend low-gauge metal with his hands, and could not be physically restrained without equipment designed for zoo environments. The Morozovs adapted by building a reinforced metal enclosure in the back sunroom, complete with climbing bars, a hammock, and a rotation of enrichment toys. He was kept indoors most of the time, with limited, closely supervised sessions in the fenced backyard. But it wasn't just his strength that changed. It was his temperament. Stefan began showing flashes of agitation, sudden barking vocalizations, prolonged sulking, episodes of destruction when left alone. He grew more possessive of objects, more reactive to small changes in routine. Some days he would press his face to the enclosure bars and watch silently for hours. Yulia dismissed the behavior as boredom or frustration. She believed her calm presence could settle him. But primatologists would have seen it differently. Textbook signs of a male chimpanzee entering a volatile stage of maturity where social dominance, resource guarding, and unpredictable aggression often emerge. Neighbors grew uncomfortable and stopped coming by. Warnings were quietly voiced, but inside the Morozov home, the belief remained. Stefan was family, and they weren't going to give up on him. On that Sunday afternoon, Yulia was cleaning Stefan's enclosure while Pavel worked in the garage. It was something she did often, spraying down surfaces, replacing enrichment items, checking the locks. According to the timeline reconstructed later, she was nearly done when Stefan began vocalizing loudly. Short bursts of barking sounds that had, in the past, meant frustration. It isn't clear whether she missed the signs or simply misjudged them. She opened the enclosure door to retrieve a plastic toy he had flung across the room. That was when he lunged. The sounds of the attack were heard by 2 neighbors. They described a sequence of high-pitched shrieks and heavy thuds, followed by a man's voice shouting in panic. Pavel had run inside after hearing the commotion and found Stefan straddling Yulia's body. Blood streaked the walls and floor. Her hair had been torn out in clumps, and Stefan was beating her head against the tile with terrifying force. Pavel shouted and threw a broom handle, which snapped against Stefan's shoulder without effect. He backed out of the house and ran across the yard, fumbling for his phone as he screamed for help. The dispatcher reported his voice as incoherent, his breath ragged, the word chimpanzee repeated over and over. Police arrived within 12 minutes, followed closely by local veterinary officials. The front door had been left open. One officer entered first and immediately retreated, radioing for backup and warning that the animal was still loose. It took a team with tranquilizers and riot shields to corner Stefan near the sunroom and sedate him through the bars. But the damage had already been done. Yulia's body was found crumpled on the blood-slick floor, her limbs twisted unnaturally, her face unrecognizable. She had sustained massive cranial trauma, multiple fractures, and deep lacerations to the neck and torso. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma and exsanguination. The injuries to her skull and upper spine were so severe that survival was unlikely even with immediate medical aid. Forensic examiners later estimated the attack lasted less than 3 minutes. Stefan, once sedated, was transported under heavy restraint to a secure veterinary compound and euthanized later that night. The incident ignited national outrage. Russia's exotic pet laws at the time were vague, relying heavily on regional enforcement and loopholes. Investigators confirmed that the Morozovs had no permits for Stefan, but with no prior complaints filed and no evidence of trafficking intent, Pavel was not charged with a crime. Animal rights groups pointed to the case as proof of the growing exotic pet crisis. Media coverage was intense for a few weeks. News segments replayed blurry home footage of Stefan at birthday parties, sitting at the kitchen table, looking eerily human. Public opinion split between shock and morbid fascination. Pavel never gave interviews. Neighbors described him as devastated, vacant-eyed, barely speaking, refusing to enter the back room of the house again. In the months that followed, he stopped answering calls and turned away friends who came to check on him. One relative reported he had packed away every photograph of Stefan and Yulia, leaving only a bare shelf where their pictures used to sit. Yulia was buried in a quiet cemetery outside the city. The headstone listed only her name and the year, no epitaph, nothing else to explain what happened behind the walls of that house, or why no one stopped it sooner. It was March 6, 2018, and late summer heat lingered in Pretoria as 15 guests gathered at Francois du Toit's property for a barbecue. The 42-year-old wildlife volunteer had built his identity around dangerous animals, a passion that began in childhood during safari expeditions across Kruger National Park. Francois thrived on admiration and attention. Friends described him as charismatic but reckless, someone who constantly pushed boundaries to impress others. What started as conservation work had transformed into something darker, a need to prove his dominance over nature's most feared predators. 2 decades of working with rejected animals had given Francois dangerous confidence. He believed he possessed some mystical connection with the wild creatures, often telling visitors that animals could sense his pure intentions. This delusion had been reinforced by years of successful interactions, creating a feedback loop that would prove fatal. His pride and joy was Napoleon, a magnificent male lion he'd raised by hand after the cub was rejected by its mother. The custom-built enclosure dominated his property's eastern section, measuring 60 by 40 feet with steel fencing over 12 feet high. Inside, Napoleon paced with fluid grace, his golden mane rippling as 420 pounds of pure predatory muscle moved with deceptive calm. African lions represent nature's most efficient killing machines. They can sprint up to 35 miles per hour, leap more than 12 feet horizontally, and generate bite forces exceeding 650 pounds per square inch. Even captive-raised lions retain fundamental predatory instincts that no amount of human contact can eliminate. As twilight painted the sky, Francois retrieved a bucket of fresh raw meat from his shed. His guests formed a semicircle around the fence, pulling out smartphones in anticipation of another feeding demonstration. The wine consumed during dinner had made Francois more boastful than usual. He stepped into the buffer area, then unlocked the inner gate, entering Napoleon's territory directly. The attack was sudden and devastating. Napoleon launched himself forward with explosive power, both front paws striking Francois simultaneously in the chest and shoulders. Before he could process what was happening, Napoleon's massive jaws clamped around his neck with surgical precision, the 4-inch canine teeth penetrating deep into soft tissue. The sound of crushing vertebrae was audible to horrified guests. Francois' cervical spine snapped like dry kindling under immense pressure. Blood erupted from puncture wounds, spraying across the dirt in arterial spurts. Napoleon's predatory instincts took complete control as he shifted his grip to Francois' left trap muscle and upper chest. The lion's powerful neck muscles contracted as he began the characteristic head-shaking motion that big cats use to tear flesh from bone. Deep lacerations opened across the shoulder and collarbone, exposing white bone beneath mangled tissue. Guests erupted into screams while someone frantically dialed emergency services. Napoleon repositioned over Francois' prone arm, his massive weight pinning the torso to the ground. The lion's jaws found purchase around the lower jaw and left side of the face, the crushing bite force pulverizing bone and cartilage. With a violent upward jerk, Napoleon tore away tissue from neck to cheekbone. Gripping the body by the torso, Napoleon began dragging his victim toward the far corner, away from screaming witnesses. Once reaching his preferred feeding spot, Napoleon settled down and began feeding methodically. Police arrived with sirens wailing as Napoleon lay contentedly beside Francois's partially consumed remains, blood matting his golden mane. A veterinarian from Johannesburg Zoo arrived with a tranquilizer rifle, but only after Napoleon collapsed unconscious could emergency personnel recover what remained of Francois de Troyes. July 13, 2013 was the kind of day where everything felt sticky and slow in West Monroe, Louisiana. The heat settled low over the town like a lid and the air buzzed with cicadas. Down a gravel road on the edge of town, a ranch house sat behind a gate tangled in kudzu. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for years, but inside it was alive, with something quieter, colder, and far more dangerous. Carl Wessner lived there alone. He was 48, unemployed by all appearances, and rarely left the property. He'd been obsessed with reptiles since childhood, and now, without a family or steady job to distract him, he'd built his entire life around them. The walls of his home were lined with glass tanks, stacked high, looped with cords, lit by buzzing heat lamps. Inside were snakes, ball pythons, boa constrictors, milk snakes, even a few venomous species housed in poorly labeled enclosures. Carl didn't care. He kept meticulous handwritten notes on feeding, humidity, and breeding cycles. His forum posts were long and opinionated, often criticizing new keepers for being too cautious. He saw himself as an expert. Some might have called him reclusive, others obsessive. But to Carl it was simple. He wasn't interested in people. The snakes were enough. The only person who came around regularly was Dennis Felder, a 42-year-old construction worker from nearby Calhoun. Dennis was the kind of guy everyone liked. Steady, good-natured, always ready to lend a hand without making a show of it. He was married with 2 kids, coached Little League in the summer, and still texted old high school friends just to check in. The snakes made him nervous, but he tolerated Carl's odd world mostly out of curiosity, and maybe a bit of sympathy. They'd met at a bar the year before and had fallen into a casual rhythm. Weekend beers, sports on the TV, and long conversations that drifted from life to work to whatever Carl was feeding that week. Carl needed the company. Dennis didn't mind giving it. The visits always followed the same pattern. Carl would eventually start talking about one of the snakes, usually Sadie, his favorite, and press Dennis to hold her. Dennis always laughed it off, but Carl didn't let it go. Over time, the suggestion turned into a challenge. Dennis wasn't reckless, but he hated looking like he was scared of something. Carl knew that, and he leaned into it. Sadie lived in a custom-built enclosure in the corner of the living room. At over 100 pounds, she was Carl's favorite. Burmese pythons aren't venomous, but they are powerful constrictors capable of crushing the life out of prey in seconds. Sadie had a history of reactive behavior. She had once struck at Carl's arm during a tank cleaning and had crushed a broom handle in an escape attempt. But Carl treated those incidents like quirks. He often described her as well-behaved, if a little feisty. That Saturday afternoon, Dennis showed up like usual. The house was hot, the snakes had been fed the day before, and Carl was in a good mood. After some small talk and a couple of beers, he made the suggestion again, one Dennis had heard many times before. But this time, for reasons no one would ever be able to fully explain, Dennis gave in. Carl retrieved Sadie from her enclosure and carefully looped the thick body across Dennis's shoulders, adjusting the tail to keep it balanced. Dennis stood still while Carl stepped back to take a photo, framing the shot in the dim living room light. The python began to shift before the camera clicked. The tightening started almost playfully, barely noticeable at first. Then her body rippled again, tighter this time, pulling inwards across Dennis's chest and upper arms. Carl hesitated, watching for a moment too long, unsure whether Dennis was reacting or overreacting. But Sadie was already tightening further. Her coils crossed over Dennis's upper chest and neck, the full weight of her body anchoring him in place. He tried to lift his arms, but couldn't. His legs buckled. By the time Carl dropped the phone and rushed forward, the python's body had locked in completely. Carl grabbed at Sadie's midsection, trying to loosen her hold, but her body was a single muscular loop. She adjusted her grip again, coiling higher, crushing his throat and compressing his ribs with every pulse. Dennis collapsed onto the carpet, flailing once before going still. His eyes rolled back, his lips turned blue. Carl continued to pull at the snake until his own arms began to tremble from the effort. Sadie didn't release him until minutes later, her body slowly unwinding as the struggle faded. Carl froze for several seconds before grabbing his phone with his shaking hands and dialing 911. His voice cracked on the call. He didn't say the word dead, just that his friend wasn't breathing and that a snake had attacked him. The dispatcher told him to remove the animal if possible. He tried, but Sadie was still partially coiled around Dennis's torso, her body loose but unmoving, her tongue flicking lazily at the air. Carl backed off and opened the front door, pacing in tight circles as sirens drew closer. Paramedics arrived within minutes, followed by a sheriff's deputy and animal control. The living room was cramped, humid, and silent except for the hum of the heat lamps and Carl's panicked breathing. One EMT knelt beside Dennis to check for a pulse, while another began the process of freeing what remained of Sadie's grip. She didn't resist. The team moved fast, lifting Dennis onto the floor and initiating chest compressions while an oxygen mask was fitted and IV lines were prepped. They worked through every protocol, but there was no rhythm, no breath. Dennis was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner's report later confirmed asphyxiation as the primary cause of death, with additional trauma to the trachea and upper cervical vertebrae. His carotid arteries had been compressed within seconds. The damage was survivable only if the pressure had been released almost immediately. But by the time Carl realized what was happening, it was already too late. Public response was swift. Animal control seized over 30 snakes from Carl's home the next morning, including several venomous species he wasn't legally allowed to keep. The enclosures were unstable and poorly labeled, some built from old aquariums or furniture. Sadie was transported to a wildlife facility but euthanized days later due to her size and aggression history. Investigators uncovered an old forum post where Carl had described her as unpredictable, a detail later included in the case file. Though Carl wasn't criminally charged, he was permanently banned from owning exotic animals. The story faded from headlines, but the truth remained. Dennis had never wanted to hold that snake. He only agreed because someone he trusted wouldn't stop asking. It was December 23, 2021. Just one day before her 22nd birthday, Jacqueline Durand was looking forward to celebrating the holidays with her boyfriend Nathan and her family. The University of Texas at Dallas student had much to be grateful for as the year came to a close. She was excelling in her supply chain management program, her dog-sitting business was thriving, and she and Nathan had recently moved past his cancer battle with a renewed appreciation for life. Jacqueline's love for dogs had been the defining passion of her life since childhood. She often shared stories about her father's golden retriever from her early years, describing how she would stare at the dog in fascination and lie beside it when she was barely a toddler. Though the dog passed away when she was only about 18 months old, Jacqueline maintained that this early connection sparked her lifelong fascination with canines. This passion eventually led her to start her own dog-sitting business business while in college. With her warm smile and gentle demeanor, Jacqueline quickly built a reputation as a reliable and caring dog sitter in her community. She had a natural way with animals that seemed almost magical to those who witnessed it. Even the most anxious or difficult dogs would calm in her presence. She frequently expressed her belief that dogs could sense good people and recognize genuine affection. When not studying or caring for her clients' pets, Jacqueline enjoyed hiking with Nathan and volunteering at local animal shelters. She dreamed of one day becoming a therapy dog trainer after graduation, hoping to help people experiencing trauma or illness to find comfort through the healing presence of dogs. The irony of this dream would not be lost on those who knew her story. Jacqueline's relationship with Nathan had deepened during his cancer treatment. Their shared experience of facing mortality at such a young age had given them both a perspective on life that few of their peers could understand. They had recently begun discussing marriage, planning a future together that would combine their shared love of animals and desire to help others. On that December evening, Jacqueline was scheduled to begin a dog-sitting job for Dr. Justin Bishop and his wife Ashley in Coppell, Texas. The couple owned 3 dogs, including Lucy, a German Shepherd mix weighing about 65 pounds, and Bender, a Pit Bull mix weighing approximately 90 pounds. Following her professional protocol, Jacqueline had previously met the dogs during a required meet and greet session. She later described how the dogs had appeared completely friendly during this initial meeting, noting that they had calmly sat on the couch while she spoke with their owner, showing no concerning behaviors whatsoever. What she didn't notice during that initial visit was the ominous sign on the Bishop's front door that read, "Crazy dogs, please don't knock or ring the bell. Call or text instead." This silent warning suggested the owners were well aware of their pet's dangerous tendencies. The Bishops had been desperately seeking a dog sitter for the Christmas holidays, posting in a local Facebook group about their first family Christmas vacation in nearly 2 decades. They had texted Jacqueline earlier that day, informing her that, contrary to their usual practice, they had left the dogs outside their kennels. This seemingly minor detail would prove catastrophic. As Jacqueline approached the house that evening, she had no inkling of the horror that awaited her. She had texted Nathan that she would call him after getting the dogs settled, planning to finalize their birthday dinner plans for the following evening. With her usual confidence around animals, she unlocked the front door of the Bishop's home. The moment the door swung open, chaos erupted. Lucy and Bender charged at Jacqueline with unexpected savagery, their eyes wild with aggression. Within seconds, they knocked her to the ground with such force that her phone, keys, and purse scattered across the floor. The dogs' attack was merciless as they dragged her from the front foyer into the living room, their powerful jaws tearing at her flesh. Later, Jacqueline would describe the horrifying sensation of feeling her skin hanging from her face and believing she was going to die. The bloodthirsty animals ripped at her with such violence that they tore off all her clothing, including her blue jeans. Their jaws clamped down on her face, tearing away her ears, nose, lips, and most of her facial features below her eyes. Over 800 bites covered her body as she drifted in and out of consciousness on the living room floor, her blood soaking into the carpet beneath her. As the attack continued, Jacqueline's thoughts turned to her loved ones. She would later describe losing all hope of survival as she lay on the rug, her most painful thought being that she wouldn't see her family again and hadn't had the chance to tell them that she loved them. The pain was excruciating, but eventually her body began to shut down as shock set in. The only reason help arrived was due to sheer luck. When the dogs dragged Jacqueline into the house, the front door remained open, triggering the home security system. The alarm company notified the Bishops, who asked a neighbor to check on their house. When the neighbor approached, one of the dogs rushed out and bit her as well, though her injuries were minor compared to Jacqueline's. The neighbor's husband immediately dialed 911. When police arrived at the scene, they faced a horrifying dilemma captured on body cam footage. They could see Jacqueline through the doorway, but the aggressive dogs prevented them from entering. One officer can be heard on the footage explaining that they couldn't enter because of the dogs. The officers stood helplessly outside, knowing a young woman was being mauled to death just feet away. It took an agonizing 37 minutes from the time officers arrived until paramedics could safely enter the home. By then, Jacqueline had lost 30% of the blood in her body. When emergency responders finally reached her, they found her clinging to life, her body mutilated beyond recognition. Jacqueline later recalled seeing emergency lights reflecting on the wall as she lay there. She described how she consciously slowed her breathing to conserve oxygen and heard commotion outside, realizing that rescue was imminent. Rushed to a level 1 trauma center, Jacqueline was immediately placed in a medically induced coma. During surgery, doctors had to resuscitate her 4 times as they fought to save her life. She remained in the coma for over a week, unaware that she had survived the brutal attack. When she finally awoke in January 2022, Jacqueline faced the devastating reality of her injuries. Her face had been catastrophically disfigured. Her ears, nose, and lips were gone. Her cheeks had been torn away, and she had hundreds of puncture wounds across her body. Despite the unimaginable trauma, Jacqueline's spirit remained unbroken. Over the following months, she underwent 18 surgeries to reconstruct her face. Throughout her recovery, her boyfriend Nathan never left her side. When she expressed concerns about her changed appearance, Nathan reassured her of his unwavering commitment. The dogs that attacked Jacqueline were later euthanized, and she filed a lawsuit against the Bishops for negligence. The lawsuit alleged that the couple knew their dogs were dangerous but failed to properly secure them or warn Jacqueline of the true extent of the risk. On June 12, 2018, the humid Florida air clung to the crowded rental home in Pinecrest, where music and laughter filled the space. The air conditioning struggled against the heat of 20 bodies packed into the living room, plastic cups in hand, as friends and coworkers from Sunshine Market drank and talked over the pulsing music. It was a typical Saturday night, until Hunter Roberts decided it was time to unveil the surprise he had been hinting at all evening. At 34 years old, Hunter had earned a reputation as a risk-taker. Tall and lean, with sun-bleached hair, he had spent his childhood exploring the swamps and backwaters of Central Florida, drawn to the wildlife that most people avoided. While other kids played baseball or rode bikes through the neighborhood, Hunter waded through murky water, flipping over logs in search of snakes and lizards. His fascination bordered on obsession. By the time he was a teenager, he had already built a collection of reptiles, keeping them in makeshift enclosures in his bedroom. Teachers at his high school remembered him as the kid who always had a snake draped around his shoulders, while neighbors grew accustomed to the occasional escaped lizard turning up in their yards. Even as an adult working as a produce manager at Sunshine Market, his real passion remained reptiles. Every spare dollar went toward his collection, buying new enclosures, feeding live prey, or upgrading his backyard shed into what he proudly called his herp room. His roommates, Michael Dawson and Tyler Freeman, tolerated it at first, but as the collection grew, so did their concern. Hunter had always been drawn to larger, more aggressive species, dismissing the risks with a cocky grin. When he first brought home a 5-foot Argentine tegu, they had argued about it, but Hunter waved them off. That pattern continued until one day he brought home something far more dangerous, something that wouldn't just bite, but kill. 3 months earlier, during a solo trip to the Everglades, Hunter had captured something far more dangerous than the usual snakes and lizards he brought home, a fully grown Nile monitor lizard. At over 6 feet long and weighing nearly 30 pounds, the muscular reptile was among the largest specimens ever spotted in the region. Native to sub-Saharan Africa, Nile monitors are one of the most formidable lizards in the world, built for endurance, speed, and efficient predation. Their razor-sharp teeth are designed for slicing through flesh, while their powerful claws make them skilled climbers, burrowers, and aggressive combatants when threatened. Unlike other large reptiles that rely on ambush tactics, Nile monitors are active hunters, chasing down prey with surprising speed, capable of sprinting up to 18 miles per hour. Their highly acidic saliva allows bacteria to fester in their mouths, creating a venom-like effect when they bite. A wound from a Nile monitor doesn't just bleed, it festers, leading to rapid infection. Despite being classified as an invasive species in Florida, their adaptability and aggressive survival tactics have allowed them to thrive. Wildlife officials warn that Nile monitors should never be kept as pets, as they remain unpredictable even when raised in captivity. Territorial and prone to violent outbursts, they use their powerful tails as whips, delivering bone-crushing blows before lashing out with claws and teeth. But Hunter refused to acknowledge the danger, ignoring warning signs that captured monitors should be reported and euthanized. He smuggled Ra home and set up an enclosure in the backyard shed. He named it after the Egyptian sun god, boasting about its intelligence and strength, but his friends simply called it Hunter's mistake. By the time the party had been going for hours, the drinks had been flowing and the house was hot and stuffy. Guests milled around, laughing and chatting, unaware that the night's entertainment would soon turn deadly. At 11:45 p.m., Hunter clapped his hands for attention, grinning as he boasted about what he had brought back from the Everglades. The shed had been closed up all day, and the heat inside would have pushed Ra into a state of heightened aggression. But Hunter didn't think twice as he disappeared outside. His guests, fueled by alcohol and curiosity, waited for him to return. Moments later, Hunter stepped back into the living room, the massive Nile monitor draped over his forearm. The room fell silent as people instinctively backed away. Unlike a harmless pet lizard, Ra's body twisted and writhed, his sharp claws digging into Hunter's skin as his powerful tail lashed. His yellow eyes darted, scanning the unfamiliar space. Muscles coiled tight beneath patterned scales. Guests later described the atmosphere as uneasy. Something about the way the lizard moved didn't feel right. But Hunter, emboldened by alcohol, dismissed their concerns, laughing as he held Ra up for everyone to see. He encouraged people to touch the scaly hide, insisting the animal was harmless if handled properly. Then Ra struck. The lizard lunged forward, its jaws clamping down on Hunter's wrist with shocking speed. The razor-sharp teeth sank in deep, puncturing muscle and tearing flesh. Hunter let out a sharp yell, trying to shake the animal off, but Ra's grip only tightened. Nile monitors are ambush predators, using their teeth to inflict massive wounds and their powerful limbs to rip flesh from bone. Blood splattered onto the tile floor as the lizard began violently thrashing its head, its instincts mistaking Hunter for prey. Panic erupted in the room. Guests screamed, some bolting for the door while others froze in shock. Hunter stumbled away, crashing into the coffee table, knocking drinks to the ground. His attempts to pry Ra off only made it worse. The lizard, now fully in feeding mode, latched onto his forearm and began clawing at his chest. Michael and another guest rushed forward, grabbing Hunter's shoulders to steady him as he fell to his knees, blood pouring from his arm and streaking down his torso. The deep gashes from Ra's claws exposed muscle, and as Hunter struggled, the monitor lunged again, this time sinking its teeth into his throat. The room fell into chaos. Hunter gurgled, his hands clutching at the lizard, but Ra's powerful bite force and serrated teeth dug in deeper. A sickening, ripping sound filled the air as the monitor began tearing at the soft tissue of his neck, blood spraying across the floor. The guests who remained were helpless, some shouting, others dialing 911, but none daring to step closer. The attack didn't stop. As Hunter collapsed onto his back, convulsing from blood loss, Ra released his grip and latched onto his face. Clawed feet pinned his shoulders as the monitor ripped into his cheek, stripping flesh from bone in the way it would with prey in the wild. By the time emergency responders arrived 12 minutes later, Hunter wasn't moving. The first responders forced their way inside, met with the horrifying scene of Ra still tearing into Hunter's body. Blood covered the floor, his face barely recognizable beneath gaping wounds, and the lizard was feasting. Firefighters and paramedics trained in handling Florida's wildlife emergencies worked quickly to contain the agitated, blood-covered monitor. Using catch poles and heavy gloves, they managed to wrestle Ra away from the body, but the damage had already been done. Hunter Roberts was pronounced dead at 12:17 a.m. The autopsy confirmed severe blood loss and trauma to the throat, face, and arms, with bite wounds consistent with predatory feeding behavior. Large portions of his cheek, neck, and forearm had been consumed before first responders arrived. In the aftermath, wildlife officials euthanized Ra, confirming that the monitor had displayed normal predatory behavior for a wild-caught specimen. Experts reviewing the case emphasized that Nile monitors are not pets, and their powerful hunting instincts make them extremely dangerous in captivity. For the partygoers who had witnessed the attack, the trauma lingered. Some refused to speak about it, unable to erase the image of Hunter's final moments from their minds. Others struggled with guilt, wondering if they should have stepped in sooner, though none could have predicted how quickly the situation escalated. Hunter's roommates moved out within weeks, unable to live in the house where it had happened. The few guests who remained at the party that night eventually drifted apart, bound only by the horrific memory that none of them would ever fully escape. For those who had known Hunter personally, his death was a brutal reminder that wild instincts cannot be tamed. In the end, he was never in control, not of Ra and not of what happened that night. June 2, 2015 was already hot by mid-morning in the rural outskirts of Ocala, Florida. The cicadas had started early, buzzing through the palmettos, and the air inside the single-story home on Lake Eaton Road was thick with humidity and the faint, sour scent of reptile musk. Windows were shut tight, blankets had been tacked over them to block sunlight. Inside, the rooms were dim and cramped, lined wall-to-wall with stacked terrariums, mismatched heat lamps, and makeshift shelving covered in feeding charts, molted skins, and empty syringes. The man who lived there was 61-year-old Carl Dempsey, and he hadn't let an inspector through that door in over a decade. But that morning, something would finally get out, and help would come too late. Carl had once worked in landscaping, but after an injury in his late 40s, he withdrew from most public life. He sold his equipment, stopped answering phone calls from extended family, and poured everything into his true passion: snakes. Reticulated pythons, gaboon vipers, timber rattlesnakes, corn snakes. He didn't just keep them, he bred them, traded them, studied them obsessively. Most were acquired through back channels, online forums, private dealers, message boards, where exotic reptile owners swapped advice, photos, and the occasional illegal specimen. Florida's laws had changed in 2010, tightening restrictions on venomous snakes and requiring permits for certain species. Carl had ignored them. He stopped renewing licenses, refused to register new additions, and ranted online about government overreach. In the tight-knit world of underground herpetology, he was known as a purist, someone who believed in personal responsibility over regulation. He didn't see it as dangerous, he saw it as freedom. On that Tuesday, one of Carl's few in-person friends, 44-year-old Dave Holbrook, arrived for a visit. The two had met years earlier on a reptile enthusiast message board and bonded over a shared love of rare species. Dave didn't keep venomous snakes himself, but he admired Carl's collection, and Carl loved showing it off. That morning, after coffee and a half-hearted discussion about caging upgrades, Carl led Dave into the back room where the real show began. He opened the lid of a glass enclosure and reached inside. Coiled beneath a fake log was a West African bush viper, small, iridescent, and deceptively calm. Its emerald green scales shimmered under the red heat lamp, and for a moment the snake didn't move. Carl extended his hand confidently, intending to guide it out with a hook, but opted instead for his usual bare hand method. As his fingers hovered over the coils, the viper lashed out. It struck faster than either man could register. The motion was so fast, so fluid, that it was almost over before it began. Just a flash of movement and the sharp pop of fangs breaking skin. The snake latched onto the knuckle of Carl's left index finger and held it for nearly 2 seconds. Jaws clamped tight before retreating back into the shadows of the enclosure. Carl recoiled instantly, swearing, blood running down the side of his hand. The bite marks were clean but deep, 2 dark punctures already beginning to swell. He squeezed the wound, cursing again, and tried to laugh it off, waving away Dave's concern. But Dave had seen the strike. He knew enough about venomous snakes to recognize what they were dealing with, and it wasn't a dry bite. Within minutes, Carl's hand began to change. The skin around the bite turned red, then purple, then nearly black. His fingers stiffened, curling involuntarily, and the veins in his wrist bulged beneath the surface. Dave hovered anxiously, urging him to call for help, but Carl refused, shaking his head and stumbling to the kitchen to grab his makeshift first aid supplies. His attempt to treat the bite was crude. He rinsed the wound under cold water, applied antibiotic ointment, and wrapped it in gauze that quickly soaked through with blood. He had no antivenom, few private keepers did, and even fewer had the legal ability to store or administer it. Instead, he downed 2 Benadryl tablets and poured himself half a glass of whiskey, muttering that it would all blow over. But it didn't. By the 40-minute mark, the swelling had spread past his elbow. His breathing grew shallow and sweat beaded on his forehead as his body temperature began to drop. He vomited twice, collapsing onto the floor and groaning in pain. His vision blurred, and when he tried to sit up, he collapsed again, this time harder. His hand, now 3 times its normal size, had turned nearly blue. Dave begged him to let him call 911, but Carl grew angry, panicked in a way Dave hadn't seen before. He muttered about the state taking his snakes, about raids and citations, about everything he'd built being destroyed. He said it wasn't worth it. He said he just needed to rest. And then he passed out. Right there on the linoleum floor, his arm grotesquely swollen and leaking blood through the gauze. His lips had turned pale, his breathing was ragged, shallow, and spaced unevenly. At 3:40 p.m., after watching Carl seize violently and lose consciousness again, Dave finally picked up the phone and made the call, ignoring his friend's warnings and deciding that saving his life mattered more than protecting his illegal hobby. Paramedics arrived 9 minutes later, forced to enter through the back door when no one answered. They found Carl on the living room floor, unresponsive, his arm mottled and swollen nearly to the shoulder. He was barely breathing. They attempted resuscitation on site and administered epinephrine and fluids. But by the time the ambulance reached the hospital, Carl had gone into full cardiac arrest. He was pronounced dead at 4:32 p.m. Inside the home, first responders found over 70 snakes. Several venomous, most improperly housed, and none legally documented. Animal control officers were called in to begin the process of identifying and removing the reptiles. Some were euthanized on the spot, others were transferred to wildlife sanctuaries and research centers. The entire house was deemed a biohazard. Carl's collection, his obsession, was dismantled within 48 hours. There was no funeral, no obituary. Dave provided a statement to authorities and quietly deleted his forum accounts a few weeks later. Online, in the darker corners of the reptile community, a few posts appeared mourning Carl's death. Others called him a martyr, someone who had died for the freedom to keep what he loved. But outside that world, the story was simple. A man ignored the law. He kept dangerous animals in secret, and when one of them bit him, he refused the help that could have saved his life. Not because there wasn't time, not because help didn't come, but because he didn't want anyone to know. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.